Welcome to the Most Powerful Life, February 2017 educational series. I'm Marlene McCallum, your host and the founder of Most Powerful Life. This month, it's my privilege to introduce to you Ray Sidney-Smith, president of W3 Consulting. W3 Consulting is a firm providing small businesses throughout the U.S. with practical approaches to business development and management operations using web, mobile, social, and digital technologies. Ray also organizes the two largest productivity meetup groups in the United States, one in DC and one in New York City, based on Getting Things Done by David Allen. That's the topic of today's session. Also to note, Ray's podcast was recently featured in Inc. magazine as one of the 10 hottest productivity tools of 2017. His last podcast being downloaded over 268,000 times. Ray is as passionate as he is knowledgeable, and we're in for a real treat with today's session. Today's session, how are you getting things done? Create a productivity system to match your life's needs and wants. Ray will present for 60 minutes, and then we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. You're welcome to send in your questions and comments through the webinar control panel, and I will share those questions with Ray, time permitting, and may hold some of those questions until the end. All of the key resources that Ray mentioned will be included in a handout that you will receive along with the video replay of this session. So now I will turn over today's program to our featured presenter. Welcome, Ray Sidney-Smith.
Thank you, Marlene, for having me here today on Getting More Done. I'm Ray Sidney-Smith. Hello, everybody. Today, we're going to be following a very basic agenda. What we're going to be doing is we're going to talk a little bit about the background and approach to productivity systems. We will then discuss the Getting Things Done methodology, which is the core of what we'll be discussing today. And then we'll be transitioning to a little bit of what I call Getting More Done, and it's a different sort of productivity methodology. With GTD as an underpinning, we can then get more done by looking at the whole concept of productivity sort of from a different place. And then, of course, as Marlene said, we will leave time for question and answer. So I usually like to start off with discussing with audiences how many of you have multiple things going on any given day. Just contemplate all the various things that you have going on today. How many of you feel that you have several goals that are not moving along in the way or velocity at which you'd like them to? After asking this question and meeting with and advising thousands of business owners and startups over the years, I would imagine a supermajority of you would say yes to both questions. Recent psychological and neuroscience research has identified the reasons for the conflict between having great ideas while retaining those ideas in your head and getting things done, accomplished. And I'm going to briefly explain this in a bit. But first, what currently has your attention right here and right now? Are you watching the webinar, or are you really somewhere else thinking about something else? And so what I'd like you to do is just to take a moment and to capture those things on a little piece of scrap paper, something that you can come to after the webinar, because by getting those things off of your head right now in the moment, you can actually be present with us here and now. That's the first recommendation right out the gate. Worth the price of admission, right? So just quickly capture in your mind what has your attention, so that you can get those things out of your brain, right, and get them onto something that's external, so that your brain can be freed up, so you can be here with me now. Now, one of the first things that we talk about when we talk about getting things done and any productivity system is that the productivity system is you. You are the system, and you're a system of systems, right? You have various sets of systems that you use in order to be able to be productive. And getting things done itself is a methodology, right? It's a framework that we use with a variety of different skills, strategies, and tools that we put together. And so your productivity system's ever changing, right? All the subsystems and routines that are taking place are being taken place in this overarching system that we call a productivity system, okay? So getting things done is the manual, but the productivity system is you, Okay, really keep that in mind. So when people say, "Oh, I have a GTD system. I'm a GTDer." Well, that's great. But your system is you, and it's constantly changing. And the reality is that some things are subtle changes and small changes that you can really not really pay much attention to. And some things are big changes, and those things really do need to be paid attention to. But the productivity system is really you. It's not a static set of tools. You don't just set it up and then forget it. Okay, you've got to work the system in order for it to be able to work for you. GTD also talks about this very fundamental concept of appropriate engagement. That initial exercise that I walked you through of asking, what's on your mind? Where are you right now? Are you with me? Well, that's basically the idea of being appropriately engaged, right? If you are with me right now, if you're paying attention, if you're mindful, well then guess what? You're being appropriately engaged with the world right now because you chose to be here, right? Your choice is important. And if you have self-efficacy or believe you have self-efficacy, then you should be able to make a choice like be here and be fully here so that you can learn and grow and share your passion and interests and abilities with the world. And this is really summarized very well by Bruce Lee and David Allen, the author of Getting Things Done, as Marlene noted earlier, was a martial arts instructor himself, and so he brings a lot of martial arts experience to the table regarding this, and he talks about this idea of being like water. That is, water can appear and exist in all three of our earth-like states, gaseous, solids, and liquid. And when it's in any of its forms, really, it always responds completely appropriate to the force and mass of the object that hits it. Right? So think of it as a lake or a body of water. You throw a pebble into the water, it splashes, it comes back in and consumes the rock, the pebble, and comes back to still. Well, you throw a boulder into the lake, it splashes bigger, but it then quickly, comes back over the boulder and then comes back to still. Water is by itself and its nature always appropriately engaging with the world. And we all have to do that to some extent. We all have to learn to objectively deal with our emotions and our spiritual, energy and our creativity and our logic and all of those things, and being able to systematize the more mundane aspects of it allow us to be able to then use that mental emotional energy much more appropriately. And so that's what appropriate engagement is all about, choosing the right things to do and the right ways to respond as opposed to react in the world. So I just want to briefly talk about some of the underpinnings of the sort of psychology of productivity, and just 2 points that I think are really important for us to consistently sort of pay attention to when we deal with these things. One's a kind of a sort of maybe just people don't know too much about it, so we like to talk about it just a little bit, or I like to talk about it just a little bit. And then one of my pet peeves about the current state of the psychology of happiness and personal productivity. So let's start with the first. And I think these are really I usually like to take this time to talk a little bit about the science of productivity. There are just a couple of pieces of information that I think are useful that if you wanted to do a little bit more research and understanding of this kind of material, these are places where you can start. First up is the idea of stress, okay? And so eustress and distress. These are two different kinds of stress, and we have stressors. Stressors are things that apply pressure to our being, right? So as a human being, there's pressure applied upon you, whether it's physical or mental pressure, and we then react to it. We behave in a particular way in response to it. Now, eustress is good stress. Distress is bad stress in its most fundamental thought, but there's also categorical stress, right? And so we have this idea of good stress and bad stress, and then we have the idea of volume-based stress. So that is, while some of the things on the good stress side in this list here, we have a couple of things that identify what makes something good stress. But once we have a level of volume of good stress, well, guess what? It becomes distress by its volume. So we not only have to be aware of categorical stress, good or bad, or maybe in the things that might be somewhere in the middle and quite can't decide which is which, but then volume as well. Too little stress and we don't respond. too high a stress or too many types of stressors, right? So you get 5 new big contracts this week. Guess what? You can't do them all. You're going to be overwhelmed. That's distress now. Or, oh my gosh, I got this one contract, and while it's, great, it's only one contract. And so therefore, I'm going to get it done really easily and quickly. And well, that's not really much of a challenge. So now you're going to procrastinate on doing it, right? So not enough stress, you're not going to be able to act. Too much stress and potentially volume or categorically, that's going to overwhelm the system, distract you, to basically taking you out of focus and causing issues there. So we really need to pay attention to these things. There's a wonderful book called Good Stress, Bad Stress by Barry Lenson that covers this topic. Next up is the idea of the psychology of happiness. Now, positive psychology is a wonderful field, and the founding father of positive psychology, Martin Seligman, Dr. Seligman, has really fostered an entire career as a pioneer of this area, and so people have come to me constantly, and they talk about this idea of happiness with me, and the reality is that most people are not happy, and that's not because most people are sad and lonely and depressed. It's because they're using the wrong language. And so I really want people to start to look at 2 pieces of material. One are, what's the kind of language that you're using? Dr. Barbara Fredrickson out of the University of North Carolina, I think she's out of the Raleigh-Durham campus. She has written several really great pieces of work, and she wrote a book about these positive emotions, the 10 positive emotions. There isn't quite a book about 10 negative emotions, but they are there. And what I like people to do is to write down the positive and negative emotions that you feel throughout a day, a week, a month, a year. Okay, what are those major emotions that you feel? What is your emotional palette? Right? So if you start from the highest end, which is joy, ecstasy, and down to maybe contentment and interest, and those kinds of things, and then take it to the other side, right? Apathy, boredom, maybe you're irritated, frustrated, there comes to anger, and maybe on to the other spectrum of hatred. Well, that's the spectrum of your affects, right? Your emotional responses. Well, what the heck is happiness, right? Happiness is a vague, vapid term. If you say, hey, Ray, are you happy? Well, that really means that I might be feeling a moment of joy. I might be feeling some kind of interest in the conversation we're having. But really, trying to be happy is a fruitless effort. Trying to be joyful in the moment, trying to be interested in the moment, trying to be contented now, those are the things we want to focus on. And then we also want to be aware of when we feel frustration and anger and apathy and hatred, so that we can then respond to those effectively and corral ourselves back to more positive emotions. Okay, so happiness itself isn't bad, but I think it's an arc of emotions that happen over a course of time, and we lose sight of who and what we are when we don't notice the moments in the arc, as opposed to this very vapid term. Okay, so look up Barbara Fredrickson's work and really look into what that's all about, because I think it's very powerful when you start to approach being fulfilled, being productive. That's very different, because now you can really couch your world and frame your world in a more productive, positive fashion. And finally, in this section, I wanted to just quickly cover this wonderful paper by Francis Hylane and Clément Vidal. These 2 university professors and researchers put together this scientific paper called Getting Things Done, Science Behind Stress-Free Productivity. And of course, Getting Things Done, The Art of Stress-Free Productivity is the book by David Allen. And what they cover is this really fundamental concept, and they cover a bunch of stuff in the paper, and again, I highly recommend that you go out and check it. I believe I put a link to it in the handout that you'll have. And the idea here is that you have different kinds of inputs into the brain, and the brain then is really good at processing that information, okay? But if you attempt to store stuff in the brain, too much stuff that is sort of low-level stuff, the brain isn't very good at remembering those things, because it's really good at processing, but not very good at remembering things, and therefore we have some gears that grind because of that. But if we just basically utilize the brain for information processing, it does it really well. We're capable of taking process into action if there isn't a lot of friction there. We need a little bit of friction. We do need friction, but just like driving a car, right? The wheels need some level of friction to stay on the road, but too much friction and then the car can't drive. So we need some friction and then we move forward. But basically externalizing your memory to outside sources, like a task list or a calendar or some kind of storage, folder online or on your desktop computer on a piece of paper or in a folder. You've got to get that information out of your head in order to be able to really have a clear mind. So I highly recommend you check this out. It's a great sort of background if you want to deep dive into the underpinnings of why and how GTD works. This is over 30 years of development and usage by millions of practitioners. So GTD is definitely, battle tested, battle ready, and is a really fantastic program. But I think sometimes people like to know a little bit more about what's going on under the hood, and this gives you at least a peek into that environment. Also, in the March 2015 edition of Getting Things Done by David Allen, he actually has a whole chapter on the psychology and sort of the neuroscientific research that has been done into how and why getting things done as a framework really does work. So just highly recommend that you check it out. Two other points is, again, these are links in the handout. Charlie Gilkey over at productiveflourishing.com has a wonderful general theory of productivity and then a special theory of productivity. And I won't go over the mathematics here of how this algorithm works, but you could go look it up if you really want to know. But they're really fantastic if you want to get into some of the geekier parts of productivity. I do like the special theory of productivity because really getting things done covers planning, execution or implementation, and then evaluation, that concept of review and the cycle that we go through. And in the center of that chart, you can see there simplicity, usefulness, aesthetically pleasing, connectedness, and cohesiveness are really wonderful pieces in there. I believe there are probably more pieces in there that should be there, but it's a good starting place. And again, the link is there in the handout, so you can look up Charlie Gilkey and his thoughts there as well. All right. So with the science out of the way, we get to this wonderful workflow diagram, and it really ends up being the nexus for me of everything that GTD is, right? For all of the things that David Allen talks about and sort of proffers to practitioners, this chart, the old 2001 edition of the book, when I first read it, this was the chart that really sold me on getting things done. And we're going to go through this piece by piece so that you have an understanding of how it all works. But basically, stuff starts at the top, right? Literally, stuff comes into your life, and we make commitments, and that stuff has to be flowed into some kind of repository known as the in-basket. And then by working through the diagram with simple yes/no answers in our head, we're able to then place things on the outer portions of the diagram. Basically, those things that are not hard-edged, the things that are sort of circular-edged, those circular edges are where things get placed as what I call triggers. Triggers are basically anything that tells us to do something. It gets in our way so that we know that we need to do something about it. And notice that they are all external. Going back to the Haileyan and Vidal paper, basically our brains are for having ideas and processing and creative thinking. They are not for holding ideas. Okay, it's a misuse. It's an inappropriate use of our energy and our time if we are basically going through our life and attempting to hold everything in our head. We have digital technology, we have analog technology, really, paper and pen. We have it to be able to use so that we are able to really use our energies more wisely. Okay, so we have stuff that comes into the basket. Things on the outer part of the flowchart are all basically containers or triggers to be able to tell us how and when to interact and engage with the things that we place there. So David Allen starts off with the first two stages of the workflow diagram, what he calls capturing or collecting and then processing or clarifying. Okay, and there are 5 stages to the workflow diagram. Just briefly, we basically, as we make our way through the workflow diagram, we are going to do capturing, clarifying, then we're going to basically organize things. That's everything gets organized into one of those circular bubbles. Okay, so everything gets put into one of those, our triggers. Then we review and reflect upon those things in those bubbles. And then finally, we do or engage with the world around us. We engage with the actions that are necessary to bring us to fruition. All right, so the first 2 steps: capture, clarify. What does that mean? Well, stuff comes into our world, whether that be a wedding invitation, a letter, a bill in the mail, an email with something that you have to respond to or do something and then respond to that person or individual or your supervisor or boss or client. And you get a voicemail, you get a phone call, someone walks into your door and says, hey, Bill, can you, get me that report on Friday? Or you're at the water cooler and Sally says, hey, did you watch that show on Netflix yesterday? And you go, oh gosh, no, I didn't, but I want to watch it. Okay, all of those things are stuff. They're inputs where you may or may not want to do something. Now, David Allen says that all of those things are open loops. There's some level of commitment that you have made with the world. For me, I don't make commitments until I choose to make them commitments. Okay, so just because someone mailed me, for instance, a wedding invitation, doesn't mean I've agreed to any of those things, right? They're latent. Maybe they are, a commitment. It's a priori, right, that they're a commitment. But, once I receive the invitation and I open it up and I say, oh, okay, what is it, right? It comes into an in basket. And this is where I differ in GTD over time about this. So David Allen says any of those in baskets, your email inbox, your voicemail, your the mailbox in your office, mailbox at your office, the mailbox at your home. Those are all in baskets, in boxes of some kind. They're inputs. Well, I create a buffer there. All of those I call inboxes. Okay, so you can have lots of inboxes. Voicemail and email inboxes and so on and so forth. But I only have one task in basket, okay? So I basically bring things into my in basket, and those things are things that I've chosen to filter through, sort of like osmosis. And only those things that end up in my quote-unquote in basket, my task inbox, okay, are commitments that I've made. Right, so if you send me an email and say, hey, Ray, give me $1 million, well, I haven't agreed to that. That's not a commitment on my part, right? But as soon as I open it and say, oh, you know what? I would like to give you $1 million. Don't you wish? Well, now it's a commitment, and now I have to do something with it. But if it's sitting in that inbox and I haven't reviewed it and seen it, and it's not in my psychic space, well, it's not mine yet. Okay. And I feel like it gives me a level of control to have that space between that stimulus and my response. Harkening back to Dr. Viktor Frankl and the idea between the space between stimulus and response is control. So I like to have a little bit of control there, a little bit buffer there. So I call that an inbox, and everything that comes into my inboxes that get filtered through to my task inbox, and only my task inbox are those things that I've chosen. So I will forward an email into my task inbox, right? And that will tell me that I've made a commitment. But any email that comes into my inbox is not a commitment for me. I can easily delete it. I can easily defer it to a later point in time. I'm not bound to that. Next up in the phase is to take those things now out of your inbox or inboxes one at a time and identify what it is. What is it to you? What do you think this thing is? What is its meaning to you? And this is where we start to clarify. So collecting and capturing, you can think of it as sort of a physical activity. It's an action-based item, right? Things come in, you capture them. You write them down on a piece of paper, keep them in the same space. Email comes into the same inboxes. Voicemail come into the same voicemail boxes, right? So those things come into centralized points, and they're collected. Think of them as sort of a physical collection or digital collection. That's a thing that's happening. Well, now we come into the what is it? Now we're clarifying, and that's a mental process, a mental emotional process, right? So a wedding invitation might be very exciting, might be very you feel a sense of love for the person, care for the person who from whom you've received this invitation. Now you can address it appropriately and be excited. Okay, so what is it? Oh, it's a wedding invitation. Okay, is it actionable? Well, do I need to do something with it right now? Yes, I do have to do something with it now. I'm sorry. So say no. No, there's no action with it right now. The wedding's not for 6 months or maybe even a year. Okay. Well, so maybe I need to deal with this 6 months from now. Okay. If something is not actionable and it is just garbage, well, we trash it immediately. There's no reason to keep things around, right? Shred it. There's nothing better than having a letter opener, a garbage can, and a shredder or some kind of recycling, device and bin to just get rid of things immediately, right? That's the first stage. But if it does have meaning to you, if it is something that is actionable, that's potentially actionable in the future, we have a category called someday maybe, all right? And we have different ways in which we can keep a someday maybe in getting things done. But the idea here is that we're going to put it into some kind of placeholder for later use. So we can put it in a folder, identify that as 6 months from now, and then in our system we can tag ourselves to review that folder with that wedding invitation 6 months from now, because we're not really going to do anything with it for 6 months. Right? So that's good to go. But it's basically a wait and hold kind of status. Now for someday maybes, I have, again, differentiated them in my getting things done system in two different categories. One are somedays and the other are maybes. Somedays are those items that I have decided I will do someday. Okay? They are missing a resource, whether that is time, money, a person, whatever it might be, okay? So say I want to go on a vacation with a friend of mine. Their vacation is, they don't have enough vacation time in order to go maybe in the next 3 months. So I need to readdress that at a more appropriate time when they do have that vacation time vested, so that we can then start to plan. Okay, well, that's a someday. That's going to happen. And so I'm going to identify that item, put it into a place that will remind me in the future that this needs to be done. And what is that resource that's missing? Oh, right, Anne's vacation time. She has, when she gets accrued, whatever the number of vacation hours is necessary or vacation days necessary, then we can make this vacation happen. Great. Put out there. Now it's off my mind. It's in a place that will trigger me, will get in my way when I need it to tell me to start planning that, and I can now go on with my world. Maybes are bucket list items, right? Pie in the sky. Great if I did it. If I don't, who cares, right? I'm not going to go to my grave and regret not having done these things. I will go to my grave and those will be my last wonderful thoughts if I do them. Okay, that's sort of how I think about it. Finally, we have reference. Reference are those things that are going to be held either permanently or for some period of time, and there's no actionability relating to it. It's there to trigger us when we should be triggered to know where to find that information should we need it. Okay, so I believe all reference should have some kind of sort of destruction date, right? It should be deleted at some point, and those things that fit into the exceptions are legal documents and otherwise that you would have forever, like your Social Security card or your last will and testament. Even then, those have a destruction point because you should revise those every X number of years, and definitely based on major life events. If you have children, if you have a death in the family, if you buy a different home, all of those things require you to readdress your financial and legal world, and so on and so forth. So even reference items all have some kind of arbitrary date in which you should, logical or arbitrary date, so that you should review it to see whether or not some other action, some other commitment rises from that, so that you're not losing sight of those things. So I think that one of the things people frequently forget about reference is not static. Reference is something you should continually do, but we have this reference category, and you might choose to have a file cabinet with your files in it. You might decide to have a digital filing cabinet, folder with all of your various documentation scanned into your computer for it. You could have various systems. I use Evernote very heavily as an Evernote certified consultant. I train people on how to use the note-taking and storage software to be able to handle and keep all of these pieces of information in your system, and then be able to surface it again so that you have it ready at hand. So that's no. Is it actionable? No. It either goes to trash, we throw it into someday and or maybe, and then we reference it. We basically file it for reference to retrieve when we need it. If it is actionable, then it falls to the other side of the flowchart. Okay, is it actionable? This wedding invitation, yes, it's happening in 3 months. Wow, I have a lot to do. Okay, if it's actionable and will only take two minutes or less, for example, you open up the wedding invitation, you have the RSVP card, you check off who's going to attend. Is it you, your husband or wife, spouse, partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, and you're good to go, right? You write 2 on it, you stick it into the envelope that's pre-addressed, you put it back into the mailbox, put the flag up, and now it's set for the U.S. postal carrier to take it away, right? It takes 30 seconds for you to do that. Go ahead and do it, put it in, and you're done, right? If that was the last thing you needed to do regarding this particular wedding invitation, well, great, end of story. You don't need to track it, stack it, and maintain it because it's taken care of. If it does have more than one action to it, then David Allen calls that a project. And a project is anything that has multiple actions associated. What's an action? Or a next action, as David Allen calls it. Basically, a next action is anything that I can physically see you doing, like, RSVPing with the invitation. Well, I can see you check off that item, write the number of people, who are going to be attending, placing it in an envelope and putting it into the mailbox, right? That's something I can see you do, physically see you do. And we know that actionability happens on the physical level. I can see you calling Sally about that particular project. I can see you, go to that meeting and, do that sales call. Okay, so we want to see physical actions. I can see you email. I can see you do those things. If I was standing over your shoulder, what would you be doing to move that project forward? That's the next action. Okay, and if it has more than one next action, right, it can have multiple concurring next actions. I can do any of these things, and they can all be done at the same time, or they need to be done subsequent, conditionally, right? I do this, and then I do that, then I can do this. Both of those create a project. And we should have a master list of all of our projects in life. And something that a lot of people do is that they don't keep a master's projects list. We don't know all the projects that are going on in our life, and that makes for a very, very cluttered and clouded psychic storage space, right? You've got stuff stuffed into all kinds of nooks and crannies of your brain because your brain is not good for having these, petabytes of information stuffed into it. And so when you can't think clearly, it's because one of those areas is basically tugging at you, and you are all of your energy is being soaked into holding all of these ideas and surfacing them hopefully at the right place and time. So we keep a master list of projects, and then we have what are called project plans. And this is really a support place where we can plan out projects and keep all of our supporting materials for projects. This is really a reference space for our projects. Okay, so projects and project planning area is basically where we keep projects. You might keep one master projects list, or you might keep all of your personal projects on one list, all of your work projects or professional projects on another list, and that's all the sort of organization you need for those things that are multi-step. Okay, and since it's anything that has more than one next action associated with it, you're gonna have a lot more projects than you think you do, right? And that means you're going to keep a list and review that on a regular basis, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, next up, if you go ahead and identify those things on your projects list, now we need to go ahead and decide on those things that are going to have a project associated with it, and we now need to identify that it's not less than 2 minutes, okay? So we need to delegate it or defer it to some other point in time. We've anchored it to our projects list as a project, but now we need to know what the action is associated with it so that we can go ahead and get this organized into a place so that it will trigger us when we need to. So delegate and defer. For delegating and deferring, our outer bubbles, our containers that help trigger us, are one of 3 areas. First is the delegate. Okay, am I the best person to be doing this thing? If I'm not the best person to be doing this thing for this project, right? This is a project. It is something that can be done in it takes more than one step, or it's just one single action, but I'm not the best person to do it, right? So maybe it's something to do with maintaining the car, or whatever it might be. I'm probably not the best person to, reinstall an engine in my car. Okay, I'm just really not. I'm pretty handy. I can do a lot of things mechanically and technology oriented, but replacing my car engine is probably not the best use of my time. So I need to delegate that. Okay. So again, can I delegate that right now? Can I make a phone call in 2 minutes and make that happen? Or do I need to go ahead and identify that I need to call the mechanic, find out what the cost of basically replacing the engine is, and then, continuing down there? To continue the example of the invitation, well, I might not be the best man for the wedding, but I probably need to now make contact with the best man to figure out what he is going to do about, bachelor party, other kinds of things, the rehearsal dinner, what are the colors going to be for the tuxedos. So these are things that need to be captured as either projects, and then who's going to be delegated, who's going to be identified as the responsible party. And this works out really well in a work environment because you can go ahead and identify those things. But this can happen in family groups, like if you have a church committee or volunteer committee that you sit on, and obviously within professional teams, you can really do well by immediately identifying who's the responsible party. Am I the best person to do this? If not, let me go ahead and identify that person, delegate that task. And it's sometimes not even delegating, but just sort of making recognition of the fact that that person's on point for that particular project or task. And now, what am I waiting for? What's going to trigger me that brings me back into the loop? And that's what the waiting for list is really designed for. Who do I have to follow up with? I use the term follow up. So FUW is my sort of little internal lingo, my acronym, follow up with, and then I write out who I'm following up with and for what, right? And so my waiting for is really follow up with so-and-so about X, okay? And that means that now I've delegated it. I need to now follow up with this person at what date, time, or place. What date, time, and place, if necessary. And so that's waiting for. Next is I am the best person to do it, but I'm not doing it right now because I'm clarifying, right? I'm dealing with the stuff that's in my inbox, in my in-basket, my task inbox. Okay, so I'm processing and processing. I shouldn't be doing right now. I should be clarifying. So they go into two different places for me to do later. One is a calendar, and the calendar holds three different kinds of things. One is an event. Basically, I have to be someplace at a date, time, and location, or just a date and time if it's virtual for a phone meeting, teleconference, that kind of thing. But it's basically happening for a specific time. Two are things that are day reference. You have an RSVP number for a concert that you're going to, or you have your flight number. You could put those in your calendar because they're useful to have as sort of an all-day event. You just put that information in there. And third are things where you need to be at a place and time to do something. You have to do something at a place and time. For example, there is the zoning office. The zoning office, you're working with a particular person and they say, oh, can you call me between 2 and 4 p.m. on Thursday? Because those are the hours I have this week to be able to basically do things. Okay, great. You're going to call that person at that time because you know they're going to be available there. Or you're going to, go do some errands during a particular period of time because that's the time you have, right? So you write out maybe some of your errands and you're going to go to the post office, you're going to go to the bank, you're going to go to the grocery store, all during this time frame because that's the appropriate time for you to be able to do that. That can go in your calendar. Everything else goes on what David Allen calls a next actions list. And the next actions list is basically things that you can do ASAP, right? It's in discretionary time. You can do them at any time. And he gives you categories to basically put your next actions in. You can lump them into basically categories. I say don't do that out the gate. Create one next actions list with all of your lists, all of your tasks, all of your next actions on them, and just maintain one list. If it's too much, then start to break it up into categories of things. You can put all of your phone calls in one list. You could put all of your work stuff in one list and all your personal in one list. Or you can break it up by the physical actions, calls, emails, maybe context of the software that you use. If you use a particular type of software at work, maybe invoicing software, you can have a list that's all what needs to be done in QuickBooks or in Wave or Xero accounting software, or whatever, bookkeeping or accounting software that you use. Or if it's all within MailChimp or all within your website, you can, we use WordPress in our office. So, if we have a list that says all WordPress things that we need to do, okay, great. Well, they could be for ourselves or it could be for clients that we're doing things for. So, all WordPress items can be collected together. You choose the contexts to create efficiencies, but don't lose the effectiveness of it by having it in too many places, right? Because if you have 3 tasks that sit on one list that you never look at because you have these other big voluminous lists, well, then it becomes a little bit difficult to decide on what the next action is. So I like one master list and being able to quickly filter digitally to seeing the efficient ways to doing some things, right? Okay, I can make all of my phone calls right now. Great. I can pull up a phone calls list by doing a search for call, right? Because I start every task with the word call. That's a phone call. So I can search for all those. Okay, great. There's all the phone calls that I can make. Which ones are 5-minute phone calls? Because I've got 25 minutes, I can bang out 5 phone calls. Great. I can do those now. So then we go ahead and defer it to our next action list or lists as necessary. Okay? So that's the clarifying and organizing phase of the workflow diagram. Next, we go into review and do. Okay? At this point, those are the things that happen beyond the workflow diagram, right? So we look at the workflow diagram, and this is sort of a new layer. We are basically going back to the circular points, right? The circular bubbles on the workflow diagram, and we review those things. Okay, we're going to review our projects. We're going to review our someday maybe, reference, waiting for, calendar, next actions. But on some level, we're either going to do that on a daily basis, maybe several times a day you're going to check your next actions and calendar. Are you going to check your waiting for list or your follow-up list every multiple times a day? Maybe not. Maybe you only check it once a day in the morning. Your projects, well, maybe you check that once a week, or when you feel like, well, wait, am I doing something, or I have to capture a new project that I didn't capture? Well, you're going to check that maybe a little bit less often. Your someday maybe in your reference, even less often. David Allen talks about this idea of at least weekly looking at your entire system, what he calls the weekly review. And you can read more about that online, but I'm not going to get into it. But the weekly review is this idea of covering all the bases of your productivity system by looking at it from multiple sort of horizons and levels and angles. And in the handout, I've put together a video about a GTD system I've created within Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel. You can use them in either, and there's a video covering it, and I walk actually through the weekly review a little bit in there, so you can go ahead and check that out if you want. All right, so reviewing is basically looking at each of those outer items in the workflow diagram, and then of course doing means looking at the calendar and the next actions list and doing the actions, appropriately engaging with those pieces. Now, David gets into then the idea of actionability, and what I mean by actionability is that when we think about a time horizon, things end up being more actionable the closer they are, right? We really only have true control maybe over the next 5 minutes of our life. And, beyond 5 minutes, then all kinds of things really get in the way. Decisions happen within basically milliseconds, and then we can affect change to our physical environment by doing next actions. That's the ground level, or what David Allen calls the ground level. You'll see in the gray on the left-hand side are the horizons that David Allen uses in his new language. The elevations, 50,000 feet down to runway, are sort of the airplane flying analogy that he used in the original book. And so I'm going to use the new terminology just to be consistent. So the ground level are basically where actions happen. The rubber meets the road, friction, and you go, right? We step up a level, and those are your projects, okay? And projects are anything that is more than one next action. So 2 steps or more, and it becomes a project. We want to basically take a step above doing, right? You can't buy a house, right? What's the next action for buying a house? Well, any number of things, but it might be call your mortgage, financial institution, bank representative and get a pre-qualification. That's a next action, right? But the project, you can't buy a house. Buying a house is a project, right? It's multiple things that need to be done to get you to an end goal. So that we step away from actionability, but there's something still vital about knowing that that's a project. That's something on your plate. You want to buy a house. Next up is areas of responsibility. David Allen is now calling it areas of focus and accountability. And so areas of responsibility at the Horizon 2 basically are those things where we identify our roles and our responsibilities and accountabilities to the world, okay? So I'm a brother, I am a spouse, I am a friend, I am an employer, I am a strategist, I am a coach. All of those things are categories or roles that I can apply to myself, right? And I can say, okay, as an uncle, what are the things that I want to do as an uncle to my nieces and nephew, and figure out what those things are in terms of projects and then actions underneath them, right? So thinking of your life in terms of a sort of a pie, and I'll get back to the pie a little bit later, but thinking of yourself as a pie, your life as a pie, then allows us to be able to slice and dice it and figure out where we're going to appropriate energy. Next up is short-term and long-term goals at Horizon 3 and 4. Short-term are those things that are 1 year or more. What that naturally means is that a project is anything that's actively being worked on for within 1 year. Okay, so a project takes a year or less. Those things that now step up into short-term goals are 1 to 2 years. Long-term goals are 3 to 5 years. And then we step up to Horizon 5, mission and purpose. Okay, now this can be the very high levels, purpose of life, mission in life, that kind of thing. But more or less, I like to think of Horizon 5 as the why to almost everything below it, right? So long-term, short-term goals, your areas of focus and accountabilities, your areas of responsibility, projects and actions. We're asking the question at the Horizon 5 level at each of those, right? We're asking, why are we doing this? What's our motivation? Because we really want to understand how to focus, how to organize ourselves, and then fundamentally what our motivation is. Now, several years ago, I wrote an article. I was being interviewed for a podcast, Mike's on Mike's. Mike Vardy over at productivityist.com invited me onto his podcast as a guest, and we were talking about the horizons, and this came up, this idea of a new horizon I had created called 15,000 feet. I would guess that's Horizon 1.5. And I called them programs. And basically, these are things that are not projects in my mind, but they're not areas of responsibility or areas of accountability and focus and accountabilities in the sense of tracking them as roles and responsibilities. So I created this thing called programs. And programs are things that last for me, they're ongoing. They're a going concern. So that might be my podcast that Marlene mentioned at the top. That's something that I plan to continue on into the future, and it has no end date. I haven't decided on an end date, or it does have an end date, maybe, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it doesn't matter, but it's not a project because it's not something that I have to actively work on to identify next actions. It's sort of an umbrella of a variety of different projects, right? So what David Allen would probably call a project within a project are those sub-projects, but I don't like that term. I like the idea of having a true term for something, which are just programs. So my companies, I have several different companies, those are programs, and the divisions within those companies are also programs. So I have a variety of different programs. I've each of my podcasts, my blogs, my different projects that I have going on in life that are just ongoing things. They're no longer projects. I've elevated them to this level called programs. And you can see in the handout there's a link to the blog post where I explain it, and actually in the comments where people ask some questions about it, and it will help you sort of clarify what I mean by programs. But I recommend you check it out if you are interested in this sort of space between areas of responsibility or areas of focus and accountabilities and projects. If you need some wiggle room there, like I did, 15,000 feet is a really good space. And there goes the link to it, productivityist.com/15,000-feet. We'll take you to the blog post and you can go read up on it. Okay, so that is the horizons, the Horizon 5 down to the ground level, and the idea of basically contextualizing now a different axis of productivity. We've gone over the the horizontal axis of next actions, right? How to process, right? How to capture from one side, clarify, organize, review and reflect, and then do and engage. That's along that horizontal axis of actionability, and then we go up horizons along the x-axis of taking ourselves from actionability and away from it, but appropriately disengaging from action in order to see higher motivations. What's motivating us to do these actions? It's the stuff above it, and that's how we get there. So that's the workflow diagram in a nutshell, and I just want to briefly sort of recap what I talked about because I think it's really helpful to sort of get it and hear it in different ways. And so this is basically the workflow diagram in Redux for summary purposes. Okay, so your number one is collecting and capturing. Your mind is for having ideas, not holding them, as David Allen says. We really need to pay attention to the fact that we need to get things off of our head so that we can actually give more appropriate attention to each individual thing, whatever that unit is, whether it be a next action or a project or whatnot. And that way we can fully give our creative energy to it. I think of creativity, it's not really, I think it's sometimes misunderstood, but creativity really is just problem solving, right? It's connecting the dots. It's basically our mind doing its work free of the clutter of things that are sort of clogging the system. When we have that expanse to work within, that space to work within, that's true creativity. So the first best practice, or the ideal practice as I like to call it, is the mind sweep. This is the idea of going through your world and looking around and identifying, is everything where it belongs, okay? And then thinking about your psychic space. If you close your eyes and think about your brain and all the different spaces in your world, right? The vacation home, if you have a vacation home, your second car, or your, if you have an office, a remote office somewhere, where you visit it a couple times a year or maybe a couple times a month, whatever, you go ahead and think, okay, in my mind's eye, let me walk through those spaces. And we talk about the acronym DRESS to identify what is out of place, what's an open loop, as David Allen would call it. Now, I use DRESS to help us identify the things that are the way they should be, right? They're there in a space because they're decorations, they're equipment, supplies, and reference, right? And equipment includes furniture, supplies includes food, and then reference, those things that are for us to retrieve for knowing later when we need it to. So we think about dress as being the things that are just there, they're fixtures. And everything else is basically in a state of flux, right? It's something that doesn't belong the way it is or where it is. And we need to identify in our mind's eye or physically by looking around our spaces and defining what those things are. Is everything where it belongs the way it belongs? And if we say no, then we need to capture that. And that goes into what's called a mind sweep. Now, a mind sweep can happen in any number of ways. We can do what's called a mind map using either technology, digital technology, or just a piece of paper and mind mapping. Or we can just create a Word document, a list, and just capture things one item line by line. And all you have to do is just write enough to capture what it is that thing represents, right? So you see a wedding invitation, you can just write wedding invitation for, Sally and Bob's wedding. And that should be enough to trigger you to come back to that later and know what it is. So you just write enough to know what that is. It doesn't have to be an action. It doesn't have to be a project. It just has to be something that will trigger you to know that thing needs more clarifying and organizing, right, for in the future. Because nothing is happening right now. Right now we've sort of paused time so that we can track, stack, and maintain, and then we'll come back to doing and engaging with that material. Okay, so the mind sweep is that first fundamental step within getting things done, is starting the practice by just going through every single room in your office and your home, every drawer, every nook and cranny where you've stuffed something in your mind. Okay, what is that nagging thing about mom? Oh, right, it's her estate planning, or, she really needs some assistance getting around the house now that dad has died, and we need to really start thinking about her general care. Okay, oh, you know what, her long-term care insurance, I really need to review that to make sure that, she has enough of that for X amount of time before we need to start paying for her to have in-home care so she can stay at home for the longest amount of time. Okay, great. We need to track all those things down. Mom, long-term care insurance, LTC. Mom, activities of daily living, mom, finances, whatever those things that are going to help you trigger those pieces, we're going to write those down line by line. And you do that with every area, both physical spaces and mental, emotional spaces in your life. Next, we process or clarify, identify the next action for everything on the mind sweep. Now, the mind sweep might take several hours. I know it did for me when I started getting things done, sort of implementing the getting things done methodology into my own productivity system. It took me 6 hours to just get everything out of my head. I believe I used an Excel spreadsheet back then, and I just took one line, every row. I just identified all the various things that came into my mind and looked at all of my various categories. Back then I was a Franklin Covey planner user, so I was very much into the Dr. Covey world, and so I looked at my area in his 4 quadrants of the physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional world. So I looked at his 4 quadrants, and I categorized everything by that, but I was capturing in those particular categories, and then I went through every drawer in my house, every drawer in my office, every room in my home, every room in my office, and I looked at the things that were in the space and tried to corral them together as much as possible so that all the magazines were together, all the books were in the bookshelf, and then identifying which books had been read, which ones hadn't, which ones I wanted to read, and then those got captured onto the Mindsweep as well. And then once they were all on the list, now I had a realistic view of what my world looked like. It was much more simple back then in 2001 than it is today, and I'm so glad that I invested in that time, because the last 15 years have been so different thanks to my ability to do this GTD methodology and build my own productivity system. So I identified what is the next action to each of those items on that Mindsweep. And then next, we go into organizing. And I really love this quotation from A.A. Milne. He's the author, if you don't know, of the Winnie the Pooh books. And so I have fond memories of him growing up. And he says, organizing is what you do before you do something, so that when you do it, it is not all mixed up. And so that's really what it is, right? It's the idea of putting them in places so that we are able to reassociate when we need to appropriately. Okay, so we organize in order to be able to get things into places that are not in our head. And this comes into very flexible terms, right? You can have a task list in all kinds of ways. I talk very frequently to groups about the fact that I'm a road warrior. I'm on the road quite often, and so I find myself in hotels very frequently for work. And so I will, if I have a few important things that I have to do in the morning, I always carry dry erase markers with me in my luggage, and I will write those things that I have to do on the bathroom mirrors of the hotel. And that way, when I get up in the morning, I get ready to run. I'm a runner. And then I go to the bathroom to, brush my teeth and wash my face. And there they are. I turn on the light. I can't miss those actions because they're right there in front of me. I've written them on the mirror in the bathroom. So, that's a task list. And it's ephemeral, right? I'm gonna erase the items off the mirror as soon as I see them, but I'm not going to miss them. They're going to get in my way the way that I need them to, so that I can get them done at the time and date and place that I need to get them done, right? That's organizing. It's so that we can before you do something, you're not getting it all mixed up, right? It's just in there. Then I have a more formal task system where I keep a task list and I keep all of those things together in one place. Finally, we want to review and reflect, whether that be a daily review, and I highly recommend that when you start with David Allen's Getting Things Done approach, you really need to review your tools every day, right? Not review the tools for their working order, but for their substance. So what's on your projects list? What's on your next actions list? What's on your calendar? And, you don't have to give an in-depth review of your projects, but just sort of a glance to make sure you haven't forgotten any projects that should be on there, just tracking them. Your next actions, what am I going to do today? And your calendar, what David Allen calls your hard landscape. once you've elevated your practice, then you'll probably graduate into what's called the weekly review, where you follow his 11-point checklist of getting clear, getting current, and getting creative on a weekly basis. So you can review, bring up the rear guard, clean up, the stuff that's been hanging out and is sort of lagging. Identify the things that need to get done in the following week under the getting current. What am I going to do next week? How am I going to get it done? What does the calendar look like? Where do I need to be? And then finally getting creative. Now that I've gotten everything in control and a good perspective on it, what other creative, cool things can I do with the additional time that I may have available to me? The really interesting thing about getting things done is that the better you get, the more you want to put on your plate. You have to resist that to some extent. So most of the people who start getting things done and we put new stuff on our plate too early on, we sort of regress and lose momentum because we put too much on. It's sort of like a smorgasbord. We get very excited and we start putting more and more on our plate, but we really should hold back so we can develop those skills of the 5 stages of the workflow process, learning how to capture, learning how to process or clarify, learning how to organize well, and then learning how to reflect and learning how to engage with our world appropriately. Learning those 5 fundamental skills and the various skills that fall under them is really important before we start putting more and more on our plate. So resist that in the initial stages. Put those on someday maybe. Get those on into an incubating stage, fine, but don't bring them into active, because if you try too much at once, you're going to go ahead and gum up the gears. Next is the doing and engaging. And engaging, David Allen gives us the 4 criteria model for choosing actions. And this allows us to really think about our world through the lens of appropriate engagement, right? Our first level that David Allen gives us is context. Okay, what resources do I have available to me? Do I have my phone with me? Do I have my laptop with me? Do I have internet access? Okay, well, that allows me to do almost everything that I would need to do usually. Unless I need to speak to someone face to face, I have most of the tools to do everything. Okay, great. Well, do I have Excel on my travel laptop? Do I have the necessary software to be able to do those things? Do I want to do some emails right now? Great. Well, I have access to email. Great. I'm going to open up email and do those emails. So this is about creating efficiency based on those types of things. Do I have the right amount of time, right? Okay, well, I look at my calls list. I can make phone calls because I have my phone on me, but I don't have my laptop. I'm sitting at the airport. I'm going to make a couple of phone calls. Okay, great. Well, I have 15 minutes till I board. On my list, I have 3 phone calls that are 5-minute phone calls. Great, I can make those 3 phone calls. Let me call the first person. This is what I'm going to call about. This is the person's phone number. I can make that phone call. Now it's truly actionable. It takes no additional energy to be able to get to making that phone call because now I'm fully prepared for it. How do I feel about making that phone call? Do I have the energy to really have this potentially difficult conversation or this very exciting conversation there in the airport in those 15 minutes? I have a 15-minute phone call. It's a sales call. I need to be really hyper energy, but you know what? This is a red eye. I'm really tired. I'm, cranky. I can't address this phone call right now. Okay, well, that's not the appropriate engagement that I should be doing. Okay, I should be choosing, calling the bank and being on with customer service support to get them to clear up some banking issue at that time, because I don't need a lot of mental energy for that. That just requires me to be on the phone and to give them my account and information and so on and so forth to fix it. That's the energy I have available then, and that means I'm being appropriately engaged. I'm giving the right energy at the right time to that thing. And finally, we use what David Allen calls priority. I call it intuition. And intuition is the idea that at any given point in time, sometimes things are just, all things are equal, right? You filter down through the first 3 criteria of the 4 criteria model, and you can do a whole host of these things all right now. And at that point, we need to use intuition. And intuition, I use the work of Dr. Gary Klein's definition for this, which is that intuition is basically using past experiences to inform our future experiences. Our past experiences tell us what was successful or what was not successful about doing certain things at certain times in certain places with certain resources, and we should do those things in those same time frames. So what has happened and worked for us in the past that we can do in the future? That's intuition. That's truly prioritizing when all things are equal. I can make this phone call, I can send this email, I can write this document, I can speak to this person, I can do this errand all right now which is going to give me the most benefit at this moment for doing that. Okay, this particular thing, because I know that when I've done this in the past, it's made me feel good. It's made, progress happen faster on this project. I know that I can do this now. That's what we do. And so that's the 4 criteria model for choosing actions: context, time, energy available, and then intuition, or what David Allen calls priority. Now, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the getting more done approach. Now, getting more done is based on a book that I'm working on, and the idea here is that for most of us, talking about getting things done is sort of a fundamental, like David Allen has said many times, is sort of a manual. It's a how-to manual. And so what I have done is sort of thought about it from a more balanced perspective, a more approach-based perspective that is looking at all of the various material that's been out there over the last 30 or 40 years and trying to address productivity from a more sustainable approach. And so what I've done is I've looked at sort of the work of Dr. Covey and those folks in sort of the pre-David Allen world, and basically those things where we talk about a hierarchical approach, right? Decide on your mission and vision, and Dr. Stephen Covey talks about the idea of, establishing your voice, what he calls your voice, your mission and vision, purpose in life. And then from there, everything will just happen, right? Once you've established that big, hairy, audacious goal in the Jim Collins world, then all of a sudden things should just fit into place and underneath it. David Allen, shirks that idea, and he says, you know what, if you want to really get things done, you got to think about the actions. You got to go to the ground level. You got to think about the individual tasks that you need to get done in order to be more productive. And I think that both approaches fit together to this fundamental center, this place in the center where you really have to operate in order to be able to really get more done. And what that really means is that we need to learn how to focus. We need to become aware of our awareness. We then need to be able to routinize, basically learn how to deal with routines, learn how to build habits, and organize our lives around habits, right? So organization is really that fundamental piece of organizing our lives. We can only create compound benefits of productivity by learning how to deal with routine. And then finally, increasing our awareness, attending to our motivations. And for me, most of that comes in the initial stages, at least, from accountability, right? We're accountable to others. And so what are those roles and responsibilities that we need to create in order to be able to do that? And sometimes that requires arbitrary accountability, having an accountability partner or otherwise, in order to be able to develop the skills like a GTD system, GTD influenced system, and being able to get there. So we really deal with focus, habit, or organizational development, then dealing with our motivations. I come to this from the world of sort of the Chinese perspective. This is the Bagua on screen, and I like to manage from sort of life categories. And I believe that your world should be sort of organized according to these life categories. And so the idea of balance, earlier I talked about the pie, right? So we have a pie, and we split our pie up into different slices. And the bagua, the Chinese bagua, some of you know this from feng shui, and feng shui basically places the bagua, which is different areas of your world and life, whether that be your relationship or marriage, personal relationships, your wealth center, your health, and so on and so forth. Each of these are the various areas of the 8 sides of the diagram. You place that over your home and other places in your world, and it identifies where these areas of your life fit, right? That's feng shui. But I just look at it from the perspective that we have to look at our world through different lenses, through different pieces of the pie. And so the first step is to really divide our lives up into different pieces of pie. And not every piece of pie needs to be the same size all the time to have what people would consider life balance or life work balance. Really, what it requires is for you to be able to use the appropriate amount of time at the appropriate amount of space on the pie, giving yourself enough energy at any given particular time so that you have a balance that's sort of a weighted balance in life. So that's what I really am talking about. Let's start from the center, which are, what are your roles and responsibilities in life? What are the various aspects of your life in which you want to create a level of focus on habits and routines that bring you to developing, to ever consistently developing in a sustainable approach? I've given you on screen here so that you can, capture these down. And again, I can provide this list to you in an Evernote note. I have a link to it somewhere that I can provide if you need it, so feel free to. But the idea here is that you can split your life up into various areas. And these are just some basic ones that I've created for myself. And they fit most common areas of life. And so, by creating these life categories, you now create a consistency across your system. And what do I mean by that? Well, not only do we now know the pie, and we know how much energy we need to give to any particular pie, right? So right now, if you're going to have a new child, or if you're going to buy a new home, those particular areas of the pie are going to be bigger than other areas of the pie. You can only focus so much energy, so much of your day on any one of those particular items. So we can look at the pie in terms of, you can look at it at a week level, at a month level, at a year level, and just say, okay, how much of that pie do I want, or must I, or do I want to give to that particular area of my life? And now we look at it, and we can now start to see what that looks like, and that can help define how we're going to identify the projects and goals and so on and so forth that expand out from the center, hub, and then onto the spokes, and then out to the ends of our hub and spoke system here. So we want to really decide on what those life categories are, but this really becomes an organizing principle, right? So for me, all of the folders that fit on my desktop, all the folders on my computer, are these folders. These folders manage the upper tier of them, and everything else sits inside of one of these folders, or inside a folder inside of these master architecture. Well, guess what? These are also calendars in my Google Calendar. I love Google Calendar, so I use Google Calendar for everything. And these are my calendars. And now I know that if I'm going to go to the gym, well, gym is going to go into my personal health calendar. Okay. And if I'm going to go hang out with a friend, it's going to go into my personal relationships calendar. And so very quickly, I can see by color coding these, all the time that I'm spending in those various areas, and whether or not they match to the pie. Does the calendar look like what my pie has designed, right? And if we color code the pie, right, we can now see whether or not we're using the appropriate amount of time. And we could do this in metrics of how much time I plan to allot, right? 25%. Well, I can look at my calendar and I can see if I have 3 hours of social time in personal relationships. Well, if that doesn't match my week or my month or my year, well, now in reflecting upon that, I know how much more time I need to devote or give, or be more realistic about how much energy I can give to my personal relationships right now, right? That gives me a very good litmus for being able to both forecast as well as reflect upon, and then iterate, make better choices in the future for making that type of life-work balance that I want to make. So take that forward. My email folders, guess what? I use the Gmail interface for most of my email, as well as the G Suite, which is formerly Google Apps for Business. I use that G Suite mail, so it's all the Google email interface. And the labels, these are the labels. Every email fits into one of these labels so that I can see those emails in their context. And, Google Drive or Dropbox, in Evernote, my Evernote stack structure, guess what? These are the stacks. They all fit into them, and so that way I can look at them. Unless they're a utility, like I have a LiveScribe pen. The LiveScribe creates its own notebook, so it's within its own stack called utilities. But other than those, these are the outer branches of almost everything in my system. Now, what does this allow me to do? One, it allows me to organize in a way that now I know where everything goes very quickly. And if there's a differentiation between where one thing might go or another, maybe look at a medical bill, right? I get a bill for going to the doctors. That could go under personal health, or it could go under finance and investment in sort of a medical receipts folder. And what I've done is I've just said, okay, whenever I get a medical bill, it's going to go into finance and investment inside a folder called medical bills. Done. Now I've made that rubric, and it will just stay that way. Yes, it could go into personal health. Yes, it could go into, another, fine. We just made a decision. That's where it always goes, and now I don't have to think about it anymore. I know where to find it. And if I need it in the future, I can just type in medical bills and it'll find that folder for me. So now it's really easy to know where things go for reference later. And I don't have to spend a lot of mental energy because I can get my fingers onto something very, very quickly just by knowing this organization because it's built into my world. And this is the original one that I created, and I've modified this over the years, but you see, this is a good place to start. And so I can not only now reference things very quickly because I can collect them and capture them and organize them all very, very quickly. I can capture, clarify, and organize them very, very quickly so that I can just, immediately get those things done. There's a rate of compound speed because they're all the same, right? I don't have to constantly be thinking about where did I organize that and how did I organize it. It's the same across all of my systems. I constantly see that organization, and therefore it helps create a concrete space in my mind for where things exist and go. And so that's just it. I decide on where things go the first time, and then they just consistently keep getting placed in those places all the time. Then, when I want to retrieve something, right, it's very easy for me to do if I'm putting everything in the same spaces all the time, and then I can depend upon search to be able to find things anyway. The other side is that I name things the same. So all things that are invoices, they're going to be called invoice first in the title of the document so that I can then look up invoices. So you decide on the nomenclature of your file structure, of your email subjects, of all of those things so that you're able to then have these life categories manage on top of that. All right. So we create some level of consistency across our systems so that everything is hopefully the same. Our physical file folders should match this. Our digital file structures, our email folders, all of those things match. And that way they're much more simple. Our mobile app structure, if you have folders on your mobile phone, those can even fit that. And I've created my own way to sort of manage those things. But in essence, they have their own format to them and their own systems so that they're all as closely related. They can't all be perfect. You know what I mean? On my mobile phone, I have something called Listen, something called Read, and those are things, reading apps, whether they be news or my blog, applications or whatever. Those are under Read because I'm reading then. And those things that are listening are apps where I'm going to have audiobook applications like Audible or Overdrive for the library or ListenVox, which is the LibriVox, I think, is the open source out of copyright audio works. Under the watch are going to be my Netflix app and my YouTube and whatever other video applications that I have on my phone. So they're going to be grouped according to not only the action associated with them, but they're going to also I'm going to have a health, personal health folder so I can access all of my apps that are personal health. It's very easy to think about your world in terms of those categories now because they're just all decided upon. Okay, so that's the getting more done approach, is really thinking about your life from the center. How do you hub and spoke your life into this sort of pie and then use and utilize your energies in the appropriate amounts? And so to get started, just to recap from what we talked about before, is really start with that mind sweep. Capture everything that's on your mind that has your attention so that you can then refocus that mindfulness on each individual item and really get down to the action. What's the next action? Create a master projects list for all those things that are projects in your life. Anything that has more than one action associated with it is a project. Finally, identify the next actions in this phase from the mind sweep. So we mind sweep, we identify what are projects, we identify the next actions associated with those things that are not by themselves just next actions, and we anchor those on a list that we could just call tasks or next actions or whatnot. And you can break them up for efficiency into various types of actions like calls or emails or at Excel or at mobile phone, whatever, but you don't need to if they're not that many. Finally, the next step is reviewing, and we go from daily review of our system to then doing not only the daily review of our calendar and next actions and maybe our projects list if necessary, to then doing a full review of our entire system through the concept of the weekly review. And there's a link to the weekly review checklist in the handout. then we want to go ahead and start to establish the getting more done philosophy, which is the idea of outlining your life categories so that you know how to organize the pie so that you're giving the appropriate amount of all of us have the same 168 hours in our week. How do you take those 168 hours and slice and dice them so that you have the appropriate amount of energy being given to each of the life categories you've chosen? So this time I'm going to hand it over to Marlene, and Marlene can go ahead and ask those questions. I can answer them, and then we can close out.
Let's see. I'm going to try to go to the ones that would probably apply to most people. So how long does it take to implement the GTD system?
Right. So for me, it took me roughly about 6 months to, I was highly focused on making this happen, right? So, my world was not as complicated back then. I had one job. I just did that job and I went home, right? I didn't have a spouse at the time, all of those things. So it took me about 6 months with full control over a lot of my time and energy and not too many complicated things. I see that usually being between 6 months and about 3 years as the time it takes to identify all the habits associated with something like this. Complex systems require, complex problems require complex systems, and that at the end of the day is what actually creates sort of a beautiful elegance, sort of a beautiful simplicity. So, somewhere between then. Don't get disheartened if it takes you longer than what you think it should. GTD, as David Allen would say, is sort of a lifelong process. You just keep getting better at getting better. And so don't worry so much about how long it will take to implement, but think about the small wins along the journey.
How critical is it to read the actual book?
It's sort of like stepping in a river, right? You never step in the same river twice. Exposure to the material is more important than reading the book. I think that if you really want to spend energy reading the book once you've done some of what I've talked about as sort of a refresher, as a fine-tuning component, sure, go ahead and do that. But at the end of the day, you might want to just pick up specific chapters and read those chapters if you have a question about them, as opposed to feeling like you have to sit down, read the whole book, and implement the system all at once. Sometimes people do chapter by chapter, and so they read a chapter, then they implement. They read a chapter, then implement. And so therefore they can go through and sort of do it in stages. And that's the way I would highly recommend it if you're going to, is sort of take them in chunks. And so I think that's an optional piece depending upon your specific needs. But there's a lot of material out there on the internet and by resources available to you at your local library and such, where you can find all the pieces necessary without having to read the book necessarily. There's also a really great audiobook edition that you can listen to the book as well.
I like audiobooks.
Yeah.
I feel like if I try to read it, sometimes I do it at the end of the night, so it doesn't go too well. But I'm more inclined to actually listen to a book during the day, and that seems to go better. So, okay, so there's a question here I want to expand on it a little bit. It's, what are the greatest benefits of GTD? And the way I want to expand on the question is that it's an investment, right? Like I would kind of need to stop how I'm already doing it and do it some other way. So there's what's the return on my investment for putting my time in and setting this system up? What's, in your experience,
right.
What are the greatest benefits?
Oh, absolutely. So I always relate this to how much is the price of clarity. How much is the price of being able to effectively make actions on things that you're procrastinating on, things that you're indecisive about. All of those things start to wash away when you have a system in place that helps you make good decisions at the right time in the right place, so that you can afford to spend more time with your family, more time with yourself, more time with just being in the present. So there's that fundamental, what's the price of more space in your world? I don't know if I can put a price tag on that, and so therefore it's a great benefit to me to be able to do that. But the other side is to be able to work better with others. being able to collaborate and share with others in a way that makes sense. There's nothing more powerful than when I go into an environment where there's a team not working and I model what and how GTD operates. And so no meeting ends without us saying, what's the next action and who's responsible for it and by when? And everyone starts to fall in line, and they create this wonderful culture. This can happen in families. This can happen in teams or committees if you're in a church committee or some kind of other volunteer group. If you're in an organization, it all starts with each individual modeling some of these practices. And it doesn't have to be all of them all at once. It could just be the 2-minute rule. It could just be capturing and collecting everything. It could be just doing the weekly review so that you're on top of the world when at least once a week so you can see what's going on in your life. So those are the real benefits, is the collateral space that's created, mental emotional space, which reduces stress and anxiety and increases your ability to be creative and think creatively. And the other side is to work better and share better with others.
Great. I have one question that is kind of in-depth and technical. So is there an app that you recommend that is GTD-like? It has project task planning like Nirvana or Asana, but syncs with Google Calendar.
So I have a couple of answers to that question. One is there's a wonderful tool out there called Task Clone. And so if you are attempting to utilize another system, I am a big fan of Evernote, obviously, and as an Evernote certified consultant, I should say I'm a huge fan of Evernote, obviously. So I really think of Evernote being such a great place for a lot of people to start. Task Clone actually takes your tasks within Evernote, and they can then connect to other calendars, for example, Google Calendar. You can actually check that out at taskclone.com, and Troy Christmas is the owner of this company, does a great job of helping manage that. And you can see here that Google Calendar is one of those options for being able to connect. I think you have to have the premium subscription in order to be able to connect to Google Calendar and Google Tasks. So that's one option. There is also this here, and I can provide a link to this in the show notes, but this is an interactive GTD software comparison table, and it has somewhere between about 150 different GTD, what they call compliant software that fits within the GTD system. So I would definitely check that out to see what your specific needs are and whether those connect to Google Calendar. Google Calendar itself has a built-in functionality that allows you to be able to create reminders so that you're able to see them directly in your calendar. And so you can actually implement GTD fully within Google Calendar. I have a preference for using Remember the Milk, and so I use Remember the Milk, and there's a Google Calendar plugin, I think it is, integration that allows me to put my tasks into Remember the Milk, and then they show up on my calendar for the day that I've registered them. So it's really a great interface because I can see my tasks, and I can also see my next actions all right there within the confines of the Google Calendar interface, if that's the only thing I have in front of me at that moment. So you have lots of different options. Also in the handout, I do provide resources to several tools from Asana to Trello to Noseby that I think all probably have good connections. Trello itself has an ability to take your Trello task, and it's called a Power Pack, I think, or a Power Up, and that actually connects to Google Calendar. So you have Trello that actually has a direct integration with Google Calendar as well. So you might want to look at that as well.
Nice. Well, thank you so much. That's so first, where do we start? When we hang up here, it's the mind sweep, yeah, for the first step.
Yeah, I would set aside some time for everyone to just sit down and either on a piece of paper, buy a stack of index cards if you don't feel like you have too many items, and just empty your head. You'll be surprised at how much is in there where you feel like the way things are not the way you want them to be or that they should be. And so if you have a lot of those woulds, coulds, shoulds, and wants, then you need to get those out of your head. So the mind sweep is really the first fundamental step to doing that. then identifying those things that are projects, things that are not, that have more than one action, and then identifying the actions thereafter.
Nice. I love starting with the mind sweep. I'm going to check in with each and every one of my clients to see if that would benefit them to start there.
Fantastic.
So thank you to all those who attended today's Most Powerful Life educational series. And a big thank you to today's presenter, Ray Sidney-Smith. For more information, resources, and next steps, please review the accompanying document, which includes the slide deck from today's presentation, along with 2 pages at the end with clickable links to resources that Ray shared today, as well as many others, to help you on your getting things done and productivity journey. I'm Marlene McCallum, founder of Most Powerful Life, a coaching firm that specializes in supporting self-employed and small business owners. If I can be of any assistance, please email me at marlene@mostpowerfullife.com. Thank you.